South Africa and New Zealand share a passion for competition, a passion for victory, and a passion for rugby. They also share a rivalry, one with the power to shape the politics and culture of each nation. It's a rivalry defined by intensity, skill, and courage. It's also defined by success and failure. When the Springboks meet the All Blacks, winning is everything. In 1996, New Zealand, arguably the greatest rugby nation in history, won their first ever series on South African soil. It had been 75 years since their first meeting, and when the All Blacks confronted the Springboks, controversy was never too far away.
We've heard all sorts of rumours about who might have been responsible, but I wouldn't repeat those because there's no facts.
Games of drama.
I saw this flower bomb coming down and it just went right here next to me.
And division.
We knew that the country had been torn apart.
That created heroes.
Well, these guys with basically near tears in their eyes of what they had achieved.
And raised the bar.
It was just so perfect, the height, it was so straight, it was just perfect.
On the rugby field, their meetings are more than just a game.
As a South African, you respect the All Blacks as the best team in the world.
History that goes back a long time. They're the nation that's given us the most amount of trouble.
Doesn't matter how we're going to win, as long as we get 1 point more than New Zealand.
It's life and death in terms of winning and losing.
It's always been that way. South Africa and New Zealand, it's no holds barred.
In 1921, South Africa travelled to New Zealand to play Test rugby there for the first time, with a rivalry already simmering. At the turn of the century, as part of the British Empire, New Zealand fought against the Boer South African Republic. Now the battlefield had become the rugby field.
Not many people knew what the war was about. It was a war for the empire, really. For a kid whose ambitions were to play for the All Blacks, the fact of this adversary was part of the gene pool, I suppose. I mean, it had been passed down. South Africa is the big enemy. South Africa is the hardest country to beat.
By then, both sides had beaten everybody else, and they were obviously jumping at the bit to get out, to show who was the best in the world.
The series in New Zealand ended all square, as did the next, 7 years later in South Africa. But in 1937, the deadlock was broken.
South Africa went over with the objective of winning this one, come hell or high water. The backline scored most of the 5 tries in the final test when the All Blacks were beaten 17-6. That made them the uncrowned world champions.
Whitewashed in 1949, New Zealand had the chance for revenge at home 7 years later. Heading into the final test, they led the series 2-1. Peter Jones provided the standout moment as the All Blacks emerged victorious for the first time against South Africa.
That moment of him rushing, really tearing away from the opposition, breaking clear, running around behind the posts, and the entire ground going completely bananas.
The following 3 series would be won by the home side, but off the field, New Zealand's association with apartheid-driven South Africa had begun to cause unrest. Shortly before the All Blacks were scheduled to arrive in South Africa for their 1976 tour, student protests known as the Soweto Uprising resulted in hundreds of casualties and international condemnation of the apartheid regime. 26 African countries refused to compete at the Montreal Olympics as a protest at New Zealand's association with South Africa.
Rugby became a pariah as a result of that, and the Olympic boycott that ensued sort of took the Olympic movement by surprise. That changed the game again, and the politics became that much more acute.
New Zealand couldn't prevent South Africa maintaining their precious unbeaten home record. The series finished 3-1 to the home side. 5 years later, when South Africa left for New Zealand, there was no separating the politics and the rugby. New Zealand had been divided.
Generally, the New Zealand rugby population wanted the Springboks there because this was what it was all about. And they had 2 tours to take revenge for. Unfortunately, it also caused a split, a division between families, between communities in New Zealand.
We were told beforehand that there would be a problem. But the police came to our management and said maybe the tour may have to be cancelled, but the New Zealand Rugby Union just said there's no way that they'll cancel the tour.
We prepared in difficult circumstances, and so did the opposition, because of the the volume of issues that surrounded that tour.
Before the first test, South Africa had been in New Zealand for a month amid worsening riots.
The game was late starting because some of the people involved in the demonstrations and the anti-tour movement had thrown glass and fish hooks onto the field. I think they were inside balls that broke open and the field was covered in bits and pieces.
Eventually the first test did get underway.
Very close game. It was wet, muddy. There were big tackles. There was a fight in that game as well. And at the end we lost, I think, 49.
We were delighted that we'd won. We were relieved. We now knew that we could beat them.
The pressure was now on South Africa to respond.
If you lose this one, the second one, the series was over.
Reinhard Klaasen, the captain, was back. They brought Germans back. That is probably the best backline South Africa has ever fielded.
South Africa's 24-12 victory meant the third test would be decisive. It would be one of the most controversial matches in rugby history.
It's one of the big events of the 20th century for us. And it changed this country, there's no doubt about that.
It was a hell of a game, you know, and there were all sorts of things going on prior to the match and during the match.
With security tight around Eden Park, the protesters took to the sky. 2 activists hired a Cessna plane to fly over the stadium.
It's very difficult for us because in the first half we played in the direction where the plane came from. So I actually saw every time when the guy threw out the flower bombs.
I saw this flower bomb coming down and it just went right here next to me. The next one hit one of the 4 front rows of the All Blacks.
I remember during the game, the flower bomb situation hit Gary Knight, back of the neck and shoulders, about 1 metre or 2 metres from where I was standing.
Despite the protests, the match continued.
That probably was the greatest introduction to keeping your mind on the job and becoming oblivious to the interference factor, and I think we probably achieved that better than the Springboks, particularly in the first half. In the second half, the game changed, and in the end, it was anybody's match.
South Africa trailed 16-3 at half-time, and then came the great fight back in the second half, including 3 tries by Rainwall.
What's the try? 22 all!
The New Zealand commentator said, and that was 22 all at the stage when the 40 minutes was over.
But the final whistle had not been blown. Welsh referee Clive Norling allowed play to continue.
I remember Mark Donaldson, who had just come onto the field. He was a live wire. And the moment we got the penalty tapped and ran him.
According to the referee, the Springboks had not retreated in time.
The referee took the extra 10 metres, which made the difference of Hewson kicking the goal or not, probably. Who will know?
Alan Hewson's penalty won New Zealand the game and the series.
The last penalty, we all know that was a wrong decision, but I think for New Zealand's sake, it was good that they won the series, especially because the country was divided between the people.
The overriding feeling was satisfaction that we'd done the job, a job that had to be done, and it was a great achievement. And disappointment that the focus for a lot of people in the country was not on actually the challenge that we overcame as a team.
It was a long tour and a difficult tour. It was time for us to go.
It would be the last time the Springboks faced the All Blacks for 11 years. In 1985, a proposed tour of South Africa by New Zealand was cancelled by the New Zealand High Court. For many All Blacks, the prospect of not playing the Springboks again was a bitter pill to swallow. A year later, 28 players originally selected in '85 arrived in South Africa for an unofficial rebel tour. They would become known as the Cavaliers.
I spoke to Murray Mexted and he said that was not the right thing to do. But at that stage, they also want to play against South Africa again. So there was a lot of problem in their country.
We were encouraged by members of the New Zealand Rugby Union to go away on the tour. And of course, the public face after we'd gone was that they disowned any responsibility at all. And so you sort of felt like you were sort of outcasts in many respects. My feelings were primarily rugby, and they always had been. They were the greatest adversary, and I was a rugby player who represented New Zealand, and I wanted very much to play against them in South Africa.
In South Africa, we were just happy to play against the All Blacks. Doesn't matter under what name.
Despite unrest in New Zealand, the Cavaliers completed a 12-game tour, including 4 unofficial tests against the Springboks. They lost the series 3-1, and when they returned home, each rebel tourist was banned from playing for the All Blacks for just 2 matches. South Africa remained under a sporting embargo. On February the 11th, 1990, after 27 years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela was released from jail. It would pave the way for multi-party negotiations and South Africa's subsequent return to the sporting arena. Much had happened in their absence. The All Blacks had won the inaugural Rugby World Cup in 1987 and then reached the semi-finals in 1991.
It was in a bit of disarray in New Zealand rugby at that stage, but we just came together and clicked and won the World Cup in '87, which was an unbelievable feeling.
By contrast, the Springboks had only played 12 tests in 13 years.
I never had the opportunity to play in the World Cup, and I had the 2 chances. One day, if I sit back and think about my rugby career, I would say that was the most disappointing time.
There was a downward spiral because you need, as we said, you need opposition, you need international opposition to better yourself.
In 1992, the Springboks returned to international rugby, and there was only one opponent to play first.
To see the All Blacks on South African soil again with the All Black jersey, and they did the haka.
The first time against them, big men, big hard men, and I suppose it's like anything, if you've never played against the side before, the first time is always a bit daunting.
From the first whistle, the All Black superiority was clear as they raced to a 20-0 lead. But then the Springboks rallied, eventually losing by just 3 points, 27-24. The fiercest rivalry in rugby had been renewed, and developments off the pitch were changing South Africa.
We had the first democratic election in South Africa in 1994. The world and South Africans were very anxious about which way that would go, but just that immense feeling of freedom that people had the vote, but also that people were voting together.
Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa on May the 10th, 1994. One of his first tasks was to prepare his country to host the 1995 Rugby World Cup. Rugby had always been a game for the Afrikaans, but in one Springbok, President Mandela saw a symbol of hope.
That gave me an opportunity to help my people, to change my people. When I say my people, it's my black people, to change their minds and say, support me if you don't want to support the Springboks. You know, at least you support some part of the Springboks, and in future you might change. And a lot of people's minds have changed since then.
Chester Williams had become only the 3rd black player to represent South Africa, after his uncle Avril Williams and Errol Tobias.
They had a big influence in my career. The way they played, the way they had to struggle to get to where they were, and they achieved that.
But as the World Cup approached, Williams was struggling with injury. Instead, it was an All Black who was grabbing the headlines, Jonah Lomu.
He came out of nowhere, really. He was 6'5.5", ran 100 metres in 10.5 seconds, and he weighed 19.5 stone. So it was a bit of an unusual thing to have running on the wing. For us to be able to get the ball to him very quickly gave him a huge amount of space.
The fact that he could change from forward to wing in such a short time, become the greatest thing in world rugby as a wing three-quarter, was just phenomenal.
New Zealand progressed to the semi-finals. Against England, Loma was again instrumental as the All Blacks reached their second World Cup final.
That was a wonderful game of rugby, and that was the epitome of what this All Black team tried to achieve.
Building on an impressive victory against Australia in their opening game, South Africa proceeded to gain momentum and met France in the other semi-final. But in the hours leading up to kick-off in Durban, the skies opened and the rain began to pour.
We were very agitated with the situation, the circumstances, the rain.
The game went ahead, and despite controversy in the final minutes, South Africa won by 4 points.
It was very close at the end, but perhaps France had scored and they should have been in the final. But that's history, and that's what happens in rugby.
South Africa had reached the World Cup final at their first attempt. It was only fitting that at Ellis Park, Johannesburg, they would meet their oldest and greatest rival.
We felt reasonably confident. You can never be overly confident. Playing South Africa in South Africa is always a pretty big ask.
If the task facing them wasn't daunting enough, many of the All Blacks had been struck down with a mystery illness in the days leading up to the final.
All I know is that it happened. We've heard all sorts of rumours about who might have been responsible, but I wouldn't repeat those because there's no facts. Right. But what we do know is that we were very sick.
It ripped the guts out of us for, I think it was only sort of lasted 12, 24 hours, but it left just so drained and it just dehydrated to hell, and then you only sort of had 24 hours to lead up to the test match.
It was really a matter of trying to get the players to believe that all the training they'd done would actually get them through it.
New Zealand required a lift, but in the Springbok camp, the opposite applied.
We had to demotivate them because we were reaching a stage where the emotion could overtake the sense and the right decision making, so we actually played it down.
What followed would change South Africa forever.
60, 70,000 mainly white South Africans chanting Nelson, Nelson.
Nelson, Nelson, Nelson.
It was one of the true moments of truth for many South Africans, and certainly white South Africans adopting this man as their leader and as their father.
That made a difference because before we had about sort of 45, 46 million people cheering for us. Then all of a sudden we had 49 million cheering against us, which makes a little bit of difference.
When he walked down the line and greeted everyone, and then he stopped for a few seconds to say to me, it says the world is watching you and we're supporting you. Just remember this, go out there and do your best. And I'm standing behind you.
As the formalities ended, it was New Zealand's turn to take centre stage. From the outset, the game was on a knife edge.
It was forwards against forwards, it was backs against backs, tackle from tackle, ruck from ruck, drop goal, penalty here, And I must say it was very, very good discipline from both teams.
Penalties were exchanged, but the Springboks had a tactical priority to stick to.
There was a steely resolve in the team, and there was a plan to get as close to Loma as possible. Not to give him room because he was awesome, there's no doubt about it.
From him being one of our huge strengths in the semi-final especially and throughout the tournament, unfortunately became one of our greatest weaknesses because in the final we just thought we'd play the same game.
At the final whistle, the score was 9-all. Extra time would be needed.
It was a tight game, and maybe the whole team might have been a wee bit down on energy.
We were exhausted after the 80 minutes. The New Zealanders must have felt even worse than us because they had a lot less support than we had.
The All Blacks refused to buckle. Penalties were exchanged early in the first period of extra time, and as the clock ticked down, the score was tied at 12-all. Then, with just 7 minutes remaining, Joost van der Westhuizen picked out Joel Stransky.
That drop goal was so perfect. I can't see him ever drop another goal like that. It was just so perfect. The height, it was so straight. It was just perfect. And the rest is history.
After 100 minutes of rugby, the referee blew the final whistle. South Africa were world champions.
Unbelievable. Tears running because of happiness. And we obviously got together as a team, made a prayer to say thank you to the Lord for the opportunity, and then we started running around the field.
South Africa wins. It was just unbelievable. The people just didn't want to leave the stadium. You know, they just stood around in awe and couldn't believe that we've made it. You know, it was just fantastic.
I think we all cried on the stadium, eh? It was just a big moment for South Africa. We expected to win because it's in South Africa, but against the All Blacks, we can never be sure.
As the celebrations continued, President Mandela presented the World Cup to Springbok captain Francois Pienaar. It would become the iconic image of the new South Africa.
Winning in your own country in those times, in that political environment, at that moment in time, just, you know, it just was special.
Black, white, everybody enjoying the moment together. It was fantastic for the country.
The Mandela thing was big. Just the whole tournament. You know, World Cups are about people, and the people of South Africa just opened their arms up to world rugby, and you know, the best stadiums in the world, and it was just a great tournament to be part of. Obviously, I would have loved a different result at the end of the day.
Everyone was so drained. You can't use that as an excuse. It happened on the day, so be it. But damn shame, because the All Blacks were in top form.
When you look back in hindsight, it was, you know, we had an opportunity. Unfortunately, obviously, there's things that happened that we couldn't change. But at the end of the day, it was an amazing sporting event.
The television and broadcast rights for all international and provincial rugby played in South Africa, Australia and New Zealand from 1996 until 2005 have been sold to News Corp for a sum in excess of $550 million.
The mid-1990s saw the dawn of a new era. Rugby union turned professional and the Tri-Nations was formed. South Africa, New Zealand and Australia would compete in an annual tournament with home and away fixtures against each other. However, there would be one last tour. A year after their World Cup final defeat, the All Blacks were back in South Africa. They'd already won the inaugural Tri-Nations before staying on to play a three-match series against the Springboks.
We had an opportunity to do what no All Black team had ever done before in '96, which was to win a Test series on South African soil.
They wanted to go back and prove a point as to how good they were in '95 and weren't able to be at their best for the final. So they wanted to do that, and they wanted to be the first All Black side that had won a multi-test series.
They had everything to lose. We had so much to gain.
Having narrowly won the first test, the All Blacks arrived in Pretoria with an opportunity to make history. On August the 24th, 1996, they took it, winning 33-26. New Zealand had finally won a series in South Africa.
I recall Simon Culhane being quite outstanding with his goal kicking, and Zinzan Brook drop kicking a goal out of nowhere like he does.
I didn't know what it meant, really, to have this series victory, but I could tell when I saw the emotion on Fitzpatrick, Zinzan Brook's faces in particular, the footage of Fitzy, him down on his haunches, you know, banging the soil, and seeing their faces, you know, you've got these guys with basically near tears in their eyes of what they had achieved.
And to beat them in their own backyard, something that so many generations of All Blacks have tried to do before, and now you've done it.
The rivalry is very intense, so not to have that series victory up until that 1996, given the history of the past, was a pretty sour point for New Zealand.
The All Blacks' victory was a fitting end to the amateur era. Since 1996, neither country has toured the other.
New Zealand is actually the ones that we want to play and want to have the rivalry against. We don't play that test series anymore, and I hope they bring it back, because I think it's really, really good for rugby.
Those tours, they're the ones to remember. They're not here anymore. I wish they'd bring them back.
The All Blacks have dominated the Tri-Nations, winning 10 of the 16 tournaments. And in 2012, they won the newly formed Rugby Championship, defeating New Boys Argentina. International rugby teams now play more fixtures than ever. Yet the Springboks versus the All Blacks remains the most eagerly anticipated clash on the calendar, both for the present-day professional and the amateur heroes of days gone by.
Patrick Lambie, who now plays for South Africa, said his greatest dream was to face the All Blacks. I think that is every schoolboy's dream.
It's just in your face the whole time. You're playing them on the field, you're playing them off the field.
Not only about rugby, it was all about politics, it was all about a real rivalry between New Zealand and South Africa.
There can be great contests between other nations, but nothing quite like All Black Springbok rugby.
Winning test matches against South Africa was great. I didn't want to lose, I'm a competitor, but I didn't know the history. I do now, boy I do.